Hey, fellow true crime aficionados. I've stumbled upon the ultimate hidden gem, Dakota Spotlight by James Woolner. It's a revelation. Picture this. Thoroughly researched, original, and peppered with real interviews. No sensationalism here. Just gripping storytelling with heart. You'll laugh, you'll cry, and you'll always want more. So cozy up and join me on the edge of your seat. Trust me, this podcast is the real deal. Start with the Mandan murders and prepare to be hooked. Let's uncover this treasure together. Listen to Dakota Spotlight.
You're listening to DNA ID, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, Scene of the Crime, Zodiac Speaking,
Beyond Bizarre True Crime,
Citizen Detective, and
Campus Killings.
all of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
On April 10, 1985, construction workers were erecting a wooden boardwalk-style walkway and staircase extending onto Crescent Beach, just south of St. Augustine, Florida. They had to excavate part of a sand shelf to place the piling, and when they got 2.5 feet deep into the sand, they uncovered bones. The spot was 10 feet above the high tide line. The bones did not get to that location by washing ashore, and these weren't bones that came from a fish or a seal. Construction was halted and the beach cordoned off while an authority was called in. Sure enough, the bones were human. 1985 video from the crime scene shows the dated police cars and medical examiner vehicle parked on the pristine beach where the shocking discovery was made. A careful excavation was done and all body parts piled on a piece of plywood. The skull was complete and had a tuft of hair on top resembling a ghoulish mohawk. Eventually, the bones, amounting to a complete skeleton, were removed to the office of the medical examiner. An examination of the bones by the ME and by experts at the University of South Florida determined that the remains belonged to a female who had been deceased for at least 2 years. She was a white woman, 30 to 50 years of age, approximately 67 inches tall, whose weight could not be estimated because she was completely skeletonized. Her remaining bit of hair was very light brown and curly. There was no evidence of any clothing or jewelry on her body. Further, her bones bore no indication of what had killed her, although they demonstrated plenty of trauma she had suffered. She had 3 burr holes in her skull, the kind caused by a drill inserted to relieve pressure on the brain caused by blood clots, fluid on the brain, or cerebral hemorrhage. She also had multiple fractures of her nasal bones, including at least 1 broken nose, some healed broken cheekbones, and healed fractures of her right fibula and tibia, her left tibia, and her left thorax, as well as 5 healed broken ribs. The medical experts posited that Jane Doe had possibly been in a car accident or been struck by a car, although that wasn't what killed her since her fractures had knit back together. Despite not having specific information on the woman's cause of death, the medical examiner ruled Jane Doe's cause of death as a homicide by unspecified means. There was no soft tissue remaining on the remains and her hyoid bone was intact, but I was surprised to learn that she had perimortem injuries that are not being disclosed as the investigation is ongoing. Those injuries, plus the fact that she was buried nude in a sand dune with a condom that was found with the body, create a totality of the circumstances indicative of murder. But without any identification or identifying items on the woman, all the investigators had to go on with regard to her identity was dental records showing occlusal fillings of 3 lower right molar teeth and matching reports of missing persons, of which there were exactly 0. Media coverage of the case when she was found also failed to yield helpful tips or leads to her identity. Jane Doe would remain a Jane Doe. Her remains were shelved, and there she sat for decades. In 2011, St. Johns County Sheriff's Office Deputy Detective Sean Tice started a push to get Jane Doe identified. He told staugustine.com in 2012, quote, "She's the only unidentified human remains that we have," end quote. He asked the media to release stories on what they knew about Jane Doe in observance of more than a quarter century of her not having a name. St. Johns County Sheriff David Shore told the media at the time, quote, "These are the remains of a human being. People knew her, someone misses her, and at least one person knows exactly what happened to her." In 2012, DNA testing on the remains was conducted by the University of North Texas, and a mitochondrial DNA profile obtained from the bones. At this time, Jane Doe was entered into NamUs as UP3036 and to the Doe Network. Leads came in but led to multiple rule-outs on the database. That same year, the FBI lab created a clay composite of Jane Doe. A VICAP bulletin released in 2013 includes images of this composite from 3 different angles and lists Jane Doe as 5 foot 6 inches tall, 99 pounds, and 35 to 50 years of age. It estimated that her rib fractures had healed 1 to 2 years before her death. Isotope testing conducted on the remains in the early 2010s by a forensic anthropologist determined that Jane Doe had spent her early childhood to early adulthood in France, the UK, or southern Scandinavia, but the last 10 years of her life were in the United States. Spoiler alert, that assessment was wrong. In 2014, the St. Johns County Sheriff's Office facilitated a facial reconstruction of Jane Doe by the Florida Institute of Forensic Anthropology and Applied Science at the University of South Florida. The St. Johns County authorities sent Jane Doe's skull and mandible with teeth attached to that institute and later released an age-progressed forensic composite of her, which I will post. It shows a woman with a long, narrow face, a slightly off-kilter nose, eyes that were close together, and significant nasolabial folds. Detectives now believed Jane Doe was 20 to 40 years old and was killed 1 to 5 years prior to being found in the Crescent Beach dune. Someone knows the truth about what happened to this person between 1980 and 1984, cold case detective Sean Tice told Historic City News reporters around that time. "Anything at all can help us," Commander Chuck Mulligan told News 4 Jackson, "and we know with time there is a chance for diminished returns. The longer this thing goes, the longer the potential that family members have passed. If they were alive today, that victim could be 60 years old." Despite all these efforts to identify Jane Doe, the case lay dormant until 2023. The previous year, in 2022, St. Johns County Sheriff's Office Major Crimes Unit Detective Sergeant Gene Tolbert attended a law enforcement cold case homicide conference that addressed the powers of forensic genealogy to give a name to unidentified human remains. That year, the St. Johns County Sheriff's Office investigators began working with the District 23 Medical Examiner's Office and the Florida Department of Law Enforcement Forensic Services Regional Laboratory in Jacksonville. They sent bone samples from Jane Doe to Othram Labs in the Woodlands, Texas. From those samples, Othram was able to extract sufficient DNA to obtain a SNP profile for Jane Doe. And when they uploaded the SNP profile to the open-source databases, they found several DNA relatives, including a suspected first cousin named Sharon. I don't have the centimorgan information, but a first cousin could be expected to share about 12.5% of their DNA, or very roughly approximately 800 plus centimorgans. Longtime listeners will recognize that that is a very strong match, and indeed, the whole process only took Othram about 6 weeks to come up with a potential identification for Jane Doe. Detective Sergeant Tolbert traveled to North Carolina and Virginia to meet with some of these suspected relatives of Jane Doe in person. His mission was to obtain DNA samples and perhaps learn whether anyone had any information on a missing woman in their family. He showed the suspected relatives the facial reconstruction image of Jane Doe and collected DNA reference samples from the cooperative relatives, including Jane Doe's sister and a man who proved to be her son. In January 2024, the St. Johns County Sheriff's Office authorities learned that indeed they had a match. Jane Doe was Mary Alice Pultz Jenkins. Mary Alice's story was shocking. She'd been found on Crescent Beach in 1985 and had been believed to be dead 2 years or more. But it turned out she disappeared in 1968, 17 years before she was found, and she had last been seen in Winchester, Virginia, a long way from St. Augustine, Florida. Mary Alice Pultz was born on July 1, 1942, in Washington, D.C. to parents Charles Pultz and Leafy May Self Pultz. The cousin in the DNA database, Sharon, shared a maiden name with Leafy, meaning she was the daughter of Leafy's brother. Mary Alice had 2 siblings, including older sister Betty and younger sister Patricia, and was raised in Rockville, Maryland. Her parents divorced and she moved to Winchester, Virginia. She married Norman Edward Jenkins on May 20, 1961, at age 18, and they had 2 children. Mary Alice's 9 years younger sister, Patricia of Virginia, now 72 years old, one of the relatives of Jane Doe who agreed to undergo reference testing to help identify the then unknown woman, told the detectives that in the late 60s, young mother Mary Alice became estranged from her family. She'd been married to Norman, working as a waitress at the Winchester Holiday Inn, and she loved to dance and listen to music. But her baby girl Christina had died from pneumonia in March 1968 at just 6 months old. She also had a 2-year-old boy, also named Norman like her husband. But I can only guess that the trauma of the loss of her baby and perhaps dissatisfaction with her marriage led her down the path she chose. Later in 1968, there was a big family dust-up when Mary Alice was caught in flagrante with her older sister Betty's husband. This was John Thomas Fugitt, Mary Alice's 4 years older brother-in-law, who went by Tommy. Family lore tells us that a gun was drawn and words were exchanged, and the whole thing was an ugly incident. One day shortly thereafter, Mary Alice left her son with her 16-year-old sister Patricia at her family's home in Winchester, Virginia, while her husband was at work. And then she disappeared, leaving with Tommy Fugitt. When they split town together, Mary Alice's family believed the two were heading to Florida or Georgia. They never heard from Mary Alice again. As time passed, Betty and Mary Alice's mother tried to find her to no avail. She was gone. After that, the family's conversation at holidays and reunions turned to where Mary Alice could be, but no one had any answers. Investigators don't know whether Tommy and Mary Alice did move to Florida or even if they stayed together. She was never reported missing, and modern investigators have been unable to find records of addresses for her or jobs she held. Tommy Fugitt, however, had known connections to Tampa, Florida, which is a 3-hour drive from St. Augustine. His wife, Betty Pultz, whom he had thrown over in favor of her younger sister, Mary Alice, reported that Fugitt often came to the area to go surf fishing, and her stepdaughter Audrey even provided a photo of him fishing in Tampa, which I'll post. But there's more information that tends to link Fugitt with what happened to Mary Alice. In 1981, Thomas Fugitt was arrested in Clayton County, Georgia, using the name Billy Joe Wallace or Bill Wallace. He was charged with the August 14, 1981 strangulation murder of his friend and roommate Johnny Evans, age 29. Here's what happened according to court documents. Fugitt, better known by his friends and acquaintances as Bill Wallace, had been friends with the victim Johnny Evans for years. They lived together until shortly before Evans' death, when their trailer was destroyed in a fire. Afterwards, Evans moved in with his brother Richard. On July 10, 1981, Fugitt arranged for Evans to obtain a life insurance policy naming him, Fugitt, as the beneficiary of the $15,000 payout, so he could take care of Evans's minor daughter if something happened to him. Well, something did happen to him. On the day in question, Fugitt was seen by Evans's brother Richard arguing with Evans. Later that night, Evans was found face down in a ditch on Lee's Mill Road in Clayton County, Georgia. He'd been strangled with a ligature. Fugitt, apparently not the brightest bulb, and this is a quote from a court opinion, quote, stopped by the home of a friend, Don Ralph. He told Ralph that his arms hurt and that he had just killed somebody. He showed Ralph a wad of money and stated that he had robbed the boy to make it look like that had been the reason he'd been killed, and he told Ralph that he would get $15,000 for it. Then he asked Ralph to help him establish an alibi, to say that he'd been at Ralph's house all evening. Ralph declined, since he had not been at home himself that evening. End quote. Okay, so Fugitt did it. He set up this poor guy Evans and killed him for the payout. Pretty simple case. Fugitt was convicted of murder in a 1982 trial and sentenced to death, but his conviction was overturned by the Florida Supreme Court for various procedural errors twice. There was some indication that he tried to hire someone to kill one of the witnesses against him, Don Ralph. There were allegations of a cover-up, of entrapment, perjury, of escape attempts, and conspiracies. It was an absolute mess that I'm not going to try to sort out, but it all goes to show that Fugitt was crazy, or he seemed to think he was above the law, or both. Finally, the third conviction stuck, and Fugitt was sentenced to die for the third and final time. And die he did, of a heart attack in prison in Spalding, Georgia on May 19, 1989 at age 50, before he could be executed. Detective Sergeant Tolbert learned that the prosecutor who tried Fugitt all 3 times never heard of Mary Alice or learned of a female companion. Mary Alice's relatives thought that Fugitt and Mary Alice had disappeared to Florida or Georgia, but it's unclear whether this was because they heard about his arrest and conviction in that part of the country. As I said, Mary Alice never contacted them, and as far as I know, neither did Fugitt. So now we know that Fugitt was in prison in mid-1981 and Mary Alice was found in 1985. But her date of death is unknown and believed to be years before she was found. Fugitt could have killed her and buried her in Florida before he killed Johnny Evans in Georgia. What do we know about Fugitt other than he's a killer of at least one person? John Thomas Fugitt was born in Maryland on April 14, 1938, to Father Bernard and Mother Edna. Fugitt married on June 20, 1955, in Emporia, Virginia, at age 17. I believe he had 2 sons during this marriage, Thomas Lee Offutt and John Lynn Fugitt Offutt, born in 1956 and 1957, respectively. Thomas Lee later changed his name to William Fugitt, reporting that his biological father was John Thomas Fugitt. After that early marriage dissolved, Fugitt married Betty Pultz, but he cheated on Betty and ran away with Mary Alice. Fugitt inflicted his toxic chaos on this family of sisters, upending marriages, abandoning children, and destroying lives in his wake. His own son, John Lynn Fugitt Offutt, was murdered in 1983 at age 26 by some men he apparently associated with. And of course, at that time, Fugitt himself was in prison, embroiled in various nefarious plots surrounding the murder he committed. So did Fugitt kill Mary Alice? Detective Sergeant Tolbert has been quoted as saying, "We don't know if he, Fugitt, had anything to do with Mary Alice's disappearance, but he's certainly at the top of our list of persons of interest." Investigators are working to establish any links between Mary Alice's death and her homicidal lover. I was told that there is very little physical evidence to work with. The condom found with Mary Alice's body was subjected to multiple rounds of expensive testing to no avail. Now, investigators must depend on finding people who knew Mary Alice for clues to her fate. Mary Alice's parents and sister Betty have all passed away. But Mary Alice's surviving family members reported that the surgical burr holes in her head were not there when she vanished. They knew of no such surgeries she had undertaken prior to 1968. Wendelin Sneed, M.D., the chief medical examiner for the District 23 Medical Examiner's Office, examined the skeletal remains in order to provide a modern pathologist's perspective on the injuries, in hopes that they could help pinpoint what happened to Mary Alice or where she had been treated for them. It's thought possible that she was in a bad accident that broke her legs and her ribs, possibly her nose, and required surgery to relieve pressure on her brain. There is the possibility that some of the injuries occurred at different times, and of course, one questions whether any of them, perhaps the fractures of the nose, cheekbones, and ribs, could have been from domestic violence, but we just don't know. Dr. Sneed also noted an abscess in the upper gum line of Mary Alice's skull that would have caused discomfort and pain, but whether she was receiving treatment for this as well remains unknown. Mary Alice's adult son, Norman Jenkins of Yuma, Arizona, remembers his father joking that his mother had gone out for a loaf of bread and never come back, a well-known trope in the mid-19th century making light of spouses who bail on unhappy marriages. In typical fashion at the time, the psychological trauma to both Normans and Mary Alice's left-behind family was not addressed. Now, her family would like to know whether anyone has any information on Mary Alice, where she was all those years, and what happened to her. Betty's stepdaughter Audrey, the child of the man Betty married after Fugitt left her, told the Washington Post, "We looked for her and looked for her." Mary Alice's sister Patricia was extremely emotional at learning the news that her older sister, whom she looked up to as a teenager, was a murder victim. She told the Washington Post, "That's an awful way to die." And Mary Alice's son Norman, a postal carrier, told the Post his initial reaction was, "I never knew the woman, whatever," conveying the detachedness he had built up over the years about his parent who abandoned him. But he said that as the news of her identification sank in, it did affect him, and he has struggled with the emotional toll the news has taken on him. It's a difficult realization that your mother, whom you assumed was off gallivanting with her lover, was actually killed and buried naked in a sand dune for crabs and other predators to devour as she decomposed into her granular grave. Norman said, "I just always thought she abandoned her family." His father, Norman, Mary Alice's husband, ended up remarrying and moving his son to Prince George's County, Maryland, where young Norman grew up. He joined the Marines and moved on with his life, but as an adult, he looked online for any trace of his mother on social media. There was none, and now we know that she was dead long before social media was even invented. Detective Sergeant Tolbert told me that the original prosecutor who put Fugitt in prison, Robert Keller, has retired, but there are approximately 20 banker's boxes of documentation relating to Fugitt, his crimes, and his background, still in evidence in Clayton County, Georgia. Investigators lack the resources to review these extensive materials for reference to Mary Alice, but have not abandoned hopes of getting that done. For now, they request that anyone who knew her, or who has any information on Mary Alice Pultz Jenkins, please send an email to crimetips@sjso.org or call Crime Stoppers at 1-888-277-TIPS. Thank you so much to Detective Sergeant Gene Tolbert for taking the time out of his vacation to speak with me about this case. Your dedication is admirable. Recently, I let listeners know about a new benefit available to them called an AbJack Insider subscription that's available through Apple Podcasts. An AbJack Insider subscription will give listeners ad-free access to every bit of DNA ID content published, both past episodes and future episodes. It will also give you benefits like early access and bonus content. Head over to Apple Podcasts and click on the DNA ID show page or the AbJack Entertainment channel to start a free trial. Thanks for listening to this episode of DNA ID. If you'd like to listen to the show ad-free and help support the show in the process, please head over to patreon.com/DNAID. And if you're interested in some fun DNA ID merch, visit the store at customizedgirl.com/s/DNAID podcast. To contact the show, please email us at dnaidpodcast@gmail.com. Follow us on social media at DNAID Podcast on Instagram, at DNAID Podcast on Twitter, or on Facebook at facebook.com/DNAID Podcast. Finally, if you want to visit our website, go to dnaidpodcast.com. You'll be able to get all the episodes of the show, leave comments on episodes that I can respond to, and you can even leave voicemails. You'll get all the latest news about the show and important updates. Find links to our social media, merch, and a lot more. It's really your one-stop shop for everything DNA ID. DNA ID is written, researched, and hosted by me, Jessica Betancourt. It's produced by me and Mike Morford of AbJack Entertainment. Music by Connor Betancourt. Check out our other collaborative podcasts, Scene of the Crime, Missing Persons, and Beyond Bizarre True Crime.